Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here for this webinar, Common Qualitative Research Designs. My name is Rachel. I am a senior qualitative research mentor here at Statistics Solutions. We are a full service dissertation consulting company. So we are here to help you really with any stage of your dissertation research, whether that is topic development or just your discussion piece at the very end in your final chapter. So we do provide a complimentary 30-minute consult, and you'll see the link pop up throughout this presentation. You can see that information here, the email address if you're interested in getting that scheduled, or you can click through this link and go ahead and get that scheduled as well so that we can talk more about your own dissertation needs and how we can best be of service. I also have Isadis with me. She will be helping out with the tech end of things today in case anything goes awry. She will also be answering any questions that you have during the webinar that she can address. Now, if you do have questions, please go ahead and put those into the questions box. Okay. Like I said, Isadis will be checking these and answering what she can during the webinar. And then at the end of the webinar, we should have some time to do a question and answer session while I will read any remaining questions aloud and responding to those so that everybody can hear the question and the answer. So everyone is in listen only in mute mode right now. So again, as questions arise during the presentation, please put those into the questions box and we will either get to those during the course of the webinar or at the end during the Q&A. So again, this is the Common Qualitative Research Designs webinar. And sort of the big first question that we need to tackle is, why would you use a qualitative research design? Okay, this is helpful. A qualitative design is helpful when you are using textual data, when you're not collecting the numbers and the statistics. You are not necessarily interested in quantifying your results. You're not hypothesis testing. Your goal isn't necessarily to generalize your findings. Okay, that's when qualitative can work really well. It's helpful for understanding perspectives, experiences, opinions, okay, from your participants. Information that you can't get, say, with a survey or a questionnaire where people are responding to, do they agree or disagree with a particular statement. So data collection in qualitative designs typically comes from interviews and focus groups. It might come from documents. It might come from observations. There are lots of different ways to collect qualitative data. Ultimately, one of the things that I like to remind everyone, and when I'm working with graduate students working on their dissertations as well, is your research problem and purpose and questions will drive your design, right? So it's not that you would set out to do a qualitative study necessarily, but it would need to be appropriate in the context of your problem and your purpose. So we'll hit 5 different research designs, and this is more of a high-level overview in the webinar of these 5. These are the most common that I see, the clients that I'm working with, the graduate students that I'm working with, and then we'll talk about a couple of less common designs that you still see out there, okay? So the common ones are case study, phenomenology, and generic qualitative designs, right? That is by far what I see the most with my clients. Less common, but as I said, certainly still out there, are grounded theory designs and ethnography or ethnographic designs. So we will touch on all of these. Case studies And I have each of these sort of broken down so we can touch on what it's good for, how it's done, what does it do, what does it generate, and then an example of each. Okay, so a case study can be really helpful if your study involves looking at a specific example or a case over time, and you're really drilling down into an in-depth analysis of that case. Okay, or that example. And so oftentimes with case studies, what we see is um, that it might be a case that is atypical for the circumstances. It might also be an exemplary case. Okay, it might provide um, data that takes researchers in a new direction or offers a counterpoint to current thinking about the case. So cases are unique and that they are bound by some uniting factor. Okay, so and we'll see what this looks like, but the case has to be bound geographically. Okay, it might be bound by commonality of participants, right? It might be that it is bound by, say, a school. Okay, but something binds it, which means that you're looking sort of at everything within that, and you're less interested in everything outside of that. Okay. Case studies are done using really multiple data collection methods. Okay. It is less typical that you would just do interviews for a case study. You know, interviews, structured, semi-structured, are common in really all qualitative research, but in addition to that, in a case study, you might also do observations, you might do document analysis. So we have different methods because again, the goal is this in-depth analysis of one case, or it could be multiple cases. So the goal is to generate a rich description of that case, or if you're doing a multiple case study, those multiple cases. And this would be like a compare and contrast if you're doing different cases, okay? And really to examine the themes that emerge from those cases. Okay, so what are the commonalities? What are the patterns involved in that case? This is what we're looking at. We're looking at, you know, this explanation of the case. So an example or a sample question for a case study might be, how do elementary school history teachers, or I guess maybe middle school is where we get into specific history classes, but where do school history teachers use project-based learning to enhance student learning? Okay, so maybe that is the broad research question that we are trying to address, and a case study is the most appropriate design for that. So what you might decide to do is use as a case a school where history teachers have implemented project-based learning curriculum. Okay, maybe they're doing it really, really well. Maybe there are data that show, you know, enhanced, improved learning outcomes for students because they have implemented project-based learning. And so this would be really that like exemplary case. Okay, and a case study could help us understand what they did, how they implemented it, such that students are doing really well. Okay, if you're doing a multiple case study approach to this, you might look at 2 or more elementary schools. Each one of those might be a different case. Okay, and so maybe let's say 3 schools in the school district have implemented this curriculum. Okay, and they're all doing well. And you would look at all 3 and you would explore each case individually, so each elementary school individually, and then you would pull those data together to look at similarities and differences in between those. Okay. So as I said, to collect data, you would use multiple methods. Okay. Part of this is because of the need to triangulate, which means oftentimes using different data collection methods. But part of this is because we're really looking at taking this holistic look at the case. And so it would be difficult to do that if we just interviewed teachers, right? So you might conduct interviews with the teachers who have implemented this curriculum. You might conduct interviews with the curriculum developers, right? They will probably have different perspectives on what's going on with, how project-based learning is implemented. Okay, you might do a document analysis of lesson plans and assignments within this curriculum. Okay, you might conduct observations in the classroom. If your IRB is cool with it, they say, yes, you can observe the classroom. You might observe teachers enacting project-based learning. Okay, so those are all your data for this. And you can do data analysis in really a couple of ways. Case study designs don't necessarily have sort of one method of data collection. So you might use a thematic analysis. You might use content analysis. You might use cyclical coding. Okay, any of those might be appropriate. Or you might find that it's appropriate to use, say, a thematic analysis for the interviews and a content analysis for documents. Okay, so any of those might be fair game and appropriate for your specific study. I also commonly see phenomenological studies, and this is really rooted in psychology, okay, but it gets applied fairly widely and broadly, which isn't, well, not necessarily a good thing, not necessarily a bad thing, I guess, but its boundaries have kind of grown, I think, over time. Um, Phenomenology is really good for exploring the lived experiences of participants and how participants assign meaning to that experience. Okay, so it's not just the what happened, it's the how participants feel about what happened, how they make sense of what happened, the language that they use to describe what happened. Okay, and so in contrast to case studies, then phenomenological studies really rely on in-depth interviews. And we are talking about possibly several hours worth of interviews. This could be multiple interviews, right? But this is really common for your data collection. And so what you would do is you would find a sample of people, and your inclusion criteria would be people who have undergone the experience of interest, have undergone that phenomenon. Okay, so you would likely have a more homogeneous sample. Okay, people would be fairly similar. And really what you're trying to do then in a phenomenological study is understand the commonalities of experience, okay, and finding a description of the essence of that experience. Okay, so not just everything to do with an individual's experience of, whatever it is, this particular phenomenon, but what are the core features of that phenomenon that are common to everybody who's been through it? Okay. So this might be appropriate if you are asking a question about how do women with breast cancer experience chemotherapy treatment? Okay. And so here, you are looking at the lived experience. What is it like to go through this? Okay, how do participants make sense of this? How do they make meaning of this? What is the core essence of this experience? And so data collection methods, as I said, you would probably conduct in-depth interviews, and you would want those interviews to be with women who have breast cancer and have, gone through chemotherapy treatment, or women who had breast cancer and went through chemotherapy treatment. Maybe either would be appropriate for your study. Maybe your study is more specific and you're looking at women who are in remission, so women who had breast cancer. Okay, but you would define your inclusion criteria to make sure that you are limiting your participants to women who have had this experience. Okay, and phenomenological studies, a thematic analysis might be appropriate. Certainly, I have seen that done. It can work really, really well if you are looking for the themes, right? Those commonalities, those patterns. More often, what we see in phenomenological designs is a specific type of analysis. So, depending on your sort of theoretical orientation, in phenomenology, because like I said, it's really rooted in psychology and then also philosophy. So it kind of requires a little bit more of a philosophical underpinning or thinking through how you want to come at this, type of study. Um, so for the analysis, you might use an interpretative phenomenological analysis. So again, rooted really in psychology, psychological studies, IPA, as you may have, some of you might be familiar with, you might have more commonly heard this, IPA. It's a very particular type of analysis that is designed to go along with an interpretative phenomenological study, okay, which also requires data collection method of these in-depth interviews. Okay, modified Van Cam method. My purpose is really not to go into these here. Have a little bit coming up in the lecture, just a brief overview of some of these methods. But modified Van Cam is another way of analyzing phenomenological data and presenting phenomenological data that really ensures that the researcher looks at what people are saying and how they are saying it. And so you do kind of these different levels of analysis on your interview or your textual data. Generic qualitative designs, I know it's a funny phrase, and I think that we can easily fall into this trap of thinking that generic is less good, and that's not what it means at all. You can have a really rigorous generic qualitative design, and oftentimes generic qualitative designs are exactly what a study needs. Okay, this happens when your research question doesn't really fit well with a case study or a phenomenological study or a grounded theory study, right? It requires something else. And so the article that I have cited here, this Percy and colleagues article, is really, I think, helpful for sort of breaking down how this works. But they talk about generic qualitative design is when the focus is outward on the actual experience and not inward, not on how people make sense of the experience. So remember, with the phenomenological design, you would be interested in how people make sense of an experience, less about the experience itself. Okay, but a generic qualitative design would be if you're really just interested in the experience. Okay. So you're not getting into kind of the psychological components of this. It can be really helpful for mixed methods studies where you're doing some kind of integration of qualitative and quantitative research in the same study. In generic qualitative designs, you can do this through interviews. Like I said, interviews kind of the gold standard for most qualitative designs. And so you will probably have an interview component, but here you may have questionnaires or written or oral surveys. So you're still collecting qualitative or textual data, Okay, but it might not necessarily be through interviews. You might have a qualitative survey that you send out to people through, a website that hosts surveys, and participants are required to write in their responses. Okay, so instead of circling 1 through 5, it's write a couple of sentences about XYZ. Okay, so data can come from really any of those sources, and it is designed to provide this understanding of the outer world content, right? Or the experience, okay? Not how people are making sense of the experience necessarily. So an example of a research question might be, how do employees feel about their supervisor's leadership? Okay, so here we're looking at the supervisor's leadership, right? What is that experience? Okay, so again, you would collect data perhaps through interviews, perhaps through surveys, okay, really structured surveys, if they're oral surveys or written, that people could either do, on paper or online, questionnaires as well. So you collect those data. And for data analysis, then a generic qualitative design really is great because it's so flexible. Okay, and this is true with the data collection methods as well. Generic designs are flexible so that you can kind of, I don't want to say pick and choose, but essentially, that is what you can do because it doesn't adhere to a specific design that runs all the way from data collection through data analysis. So you might see a thematic analysis or cyclical coding. You might do a more inductive analysis. You might do deductive analysis or theoretical analysis. Really, there is a lot of flexibility. And so again, when I say pick and choose, I don't mean that you can just sort of, out of thin air, decide what you want to do, but it needs to follow your problem, purpose, and research questions. Everything still has to be in alignment. You need to be able to justify why you're using these data collection methods and why you're using this analysis, but there's flexibility in there that isn't offered necessarily in an interpretative phenomenological analysis, for example. So, as I said at the beginning, sort of the less common designs, and again, we're looking at kind of a high-level overview of each of these, less common at the doctoral level, although perhaps more common in some disciplines than others, is grounded theory and then also ethnography. And so grounded theory is really good when there's little known about a topic and when the goal is to develop a theory or explanatory framework based on the perspectives of the participants. Okay. This is not for novice researchers. I think most people who work in grounded theory will say, it's for those who are a little bit more experienced, because it works differently than other qualitative research designs. So how it's done is through interviews. Okay, there might be field work and field notes, working really closely with participants, maybe doing some observation, texts and document, memoing. Okay, so jotting down all of your notes, all of your ideas as you're conducting data analysis, and theoretical saturation. So a lot of this sounds the same as what we've talked about before, but the direction of the research is more iterative and a little bit different. Again, the goal is to produce theory or explanation of a process, an action, an interaction. Okay, so these studies don't start with a theoretical orientation necessarily or a theoretical framework, okay, because the goal is to produce this. So unlike other qualitative designs where, you're generally required to outline a theoretical framework at the beginning, that's not the approach that you take in grounded theory. So a sample question might be, we don't necessarily know, because grounded theory studies, we don't enter into those with a research question. It starts off by collecting data on a phenomenon of interest, on a topic of interest. Okay. And so you start interviewing and you start maybe doing field work with participants, and you're generating data. And through this data collection process, you start to refine. This is where the memoing comes in. What are your participants telling you? How are you starting to group things, ideas together? Okay. And from there, you might generate a research question. And so you refine the topic and you refine the topic and you go and collect more data from more people. Okay. So it's not a situation where you specify from the outset, I'll interview 10 to 12 people, right? It could be so many more than that. And you keep interviewing and keep refining until you reach this theoretical saturation, or the idea that if you conduct more interviews, you are not going to hear new ideas. Okay. And you keep going and refining. And so data analysis follows this as well, but it works concurrently with data collection. Okay, it's this back and forth process. You collect some data, you analyze your data, your memoing, your coding, your category construction helps you refine your ideas about the topic and who you might need to interview next. Okay, and so it is this back and forth, right? And ethnography is another type of qualitative design. It's a really specific type of design that we see a lot in anthropology. It's really good for understanding a problem or a research question in the cultural or societal context or social context. Okay, it is a holistic inquiry as well. So in that regard, kind of similar to a case study. It involves networks of people and institutions and social groupings. And this is the one that is also done differently from the ones that we've talked about before. So phenomenology and case study and generic designs, and even grounded theory to an extent, because it's done through interviews, but it's also done through extended fieldwork and participant observation. And this is really what makes ethnography so different from these other designs, is it really requires either living with or living very close to for a very long time and immersing oneself in another group, okay, or another culture, we might say. So we collect data through interviews, through fieldwork. Participant observation is not just observing, but it's also participating in whatever the group is that you're studying. Okay, and so the goal then of ethnography is to produce an in-depth account of whatever that, answer to the research problem is from the perspective of participants and in this cultural context. So this in-depth account of, in the early days of a culture. So a research question might be, and I'll tell you how this is, a little bit different, because certainly you might be able to apply another design to this question. How are small scale farmers adapting and modifying their practices to climate change? Oops, I'm sorry. And so I'm using this example because it is from my own work, because I did an ethnography for my own dissertation, but this involved extended field work with small-scale farmers, okay? It involved conducting participant observations, actually doing the farming with my participants. Yes, I had interviews with them, semi-structured, lengthy interviews, but also data came from working in their farms with them. Okay. It also involved understanding things like the institutions that impacted farming. I worked in another country, so um, there were different farm organizations in the community, so I had to have a good understanding of that, right? Because this holistic picture is really key for ethnography. And so in data analysis, then, again, we can use it's a little bit flexible here. We might use cyclical coding, we might use the thematic analysis, we use constant comparison, okay? Any of these might be appropriate for all of this textual data. Um, and really the key here is that ethnography is situated in culture, okay? So beliefs, values, customs, material culture, sort of any of those aspects of a group, okay? And really looking at so the question that I have here, how are small scale farmings adapting and modifying their practices to climate change? Well, this is within this larger context, right? So it's not just understanding what farmers are doing, but also how the society around them impacts all of this, how it's all linked, okay? I have a separate webinar on qualitative data analysis, but because I have touched on some types of data analysis in this webinar, I do want to touch on a couple of these a little bit more here, just for those of you who aren't maybe familiar with these or just need a little bit more information. Really, the goal of all qualitative data analysis is to reduce data down. So you have ideally a lot of data, a lot of, textual data. It might be visual as well. And you're looking to find the patterns in it, the commonalities by reducing it down. So thematic analysis, I recommend turning to Brown and Clark for their writing on thematic analysis. Okay, it's a flexible type of data analysis that can be used for a lot of different designs. Basically involves coding and exploring those codes for themes or patterns, okay, based on similarity and starting to group data together in a way that's based on coding that you've done as the researcher, and then presenting those themes. Cyclical coding is another one that I talked about a little bit. Johnny Saldana is the sort of go-to that I would recommend for learning more about cyclical coding. Here we have a couple of different cycles of coding where we do one coding round of all the interviews and then go through again, right? Make sure that everything is coded the way that you want it to be, really sort of interrogating those codes. Do they line up to the passages of text that you want them to? There are different ways of exploring codes or different ways of coding in cyclical coding. So they might be descriptive based on you as the researcher assigning a title to a code. In vivo would be using participants' own word. Simultaneous or looking for a pattern of a code. So if there's sort of variation in experience, but it's all talking about the same experience, then that would be an example of, maybe you group that all together and that's a simultaneous or pattern code, and then categorizing those. Okay, so again, it's all, in all cases, we're looking at moving from codes to categories. And then, as I mentioned, when I was talking about phenomenology, there are specific types of data analysis associated with phenomenological studies. And so interpretative phenomenological analysis moves again from codes to categories. Here, the categories are called superordinate themes or subordinate themes, and the coding is done one transcript at a time. The categorization is done one transcript at a time, and then all of it's brought together and categorized. Van Cam or modified Van Cam is another type of phenomenological analysis that, again, uses this coding and reduction into categories, but it just has some fancy language. So preliminary coding is called horizontalization, and reduction and elimination, you follow these two questions. Eliminating any coded passages, and then you start grouping passages together. And again, as I mentioned during in my discussion of phenomenology, this is where you would be looking at sort of the what people say and the how they say it. And you do this for each participant, and then you bring this all together. Okay, so different types of data analysis for qualitative designs. But again, I do have a separate webinar on that analysis. So this is more of a high level overview. So as I mentioned at the beginning, my name is Rachel. I am a senior qualitative research mentor here at Statistics Solutions, which is a full service dissertation consulting company. We are here to help graduate students with their dissertations at any stage that you're at. This is our contact information. We provide a complimentary 30-minute consultation. We are available during business hours, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 Eastern Time in the United States. So you can schedule that using the email here. You can call. We have another link available, I believe, in the chat. Okay, and the consultation is really to find out more about your own needs as a dissertation, in writing your dissertation as a graduate student, and what we can do to help get you done, get you through the process in a timely manner, so you're not, spending years hung up on the dissertation. Everyone will get a copy of the recording tomorrow. I believe they should be emailed out, and then a copy of the slides as well. So I do have a couple of questions that have come into the questions box. Again, if you have questions about this webinar, you can go ahead and type those into the questions box. I will read those aloud for everyone, and then I will also answer them aloud so everyone gets the answer. Okay, so first question is, and I will read them in the order that they come in. So question is how to code interview data after you collect them. So this is where I probably hit on this toward the end of the presentation, because it looks like this, based on the timestamp, this came in a little bit just right before I hit on data collection. So coding can happen. I mean, it really depends on your design and what you are looking at. You can use thematic analysis, you can use cyclical coding, you can take a more inductive approach where you don't start off with any ideas about what might be in your data, any sort of preconceived ideas, or you may apply some kind of deductive analysis where you do, maybe based on your literature review, have some preliminary categories, and you start to code your interview data based on those pre-identified categories. So that might be another way to do it. But thematic analysis is usually what I recommend for my clients because it is so straightforward and really yields, I think, nice results. The next question is, can we use more than one coding technique? Yes, absolutely. It may be that you have interview data that are more appropriate for a thematic analysis, but you might be conducting a document analysis and decide that you want to do content analysis, or which is more deductive, and that you come into the analytic process with ideas for what those categories are. And so you're just in each document looking for, examples, passages of text that are aligned to those categories that you already have. Okay. And so again, the next question is how to analyze data from different methods of gathering. I mean, my response is basically the same. It's really just a matter of looking at what type of data you're collecting, what is the most appropriate for your study, and then determining which analysis you need. So if it's um, if it's observations or if it's interviews or documents, those might call for a different approach. Okay, question is, I'd like to hear more about how to resolve the tension between more objectivist strategies like counting frequencies with more post-structural techniques. I personally, and most of my clients don't do a whole lot with sort of the philosophical underpinnings of objectivist or post-structuralist or social constructivist. I I don't have a good answer for you on how to resolve the tension. Um, what I have typically seen is reviewers or a dissertation chair who wants different things. And so unfortunately, a lot of times this is kind of how it's decided. Um, I'm going to use phenomenology as an example because it is more philosophical, but also more psychological. And it is qualitative, right? We wouldn't assume that we need to count frequencies. Okay. Certainly, if you are creating a category, a superordinate theme from your data, you want that to be well represented by at least, a good majority of your participants. Okay. But you don't necessarily need to sort of talk about how many participants led to the creation of that superordinate theme or how many times that code was applied. Okay. But I have seen where chairs, even in phenomenological studies, where chairs do want to see this in the presentation of results. So, the how to resolve the tension, we're probably never going to never going to be able to do that, right? Because it does have to do with our own sort of orientation and also appeasing reviewers. And just kind of depends, too on, I mean, if you're using content analysis, that has more to do with counting frequencies because content analysis can be quantifiable. But it also, yeah, if you're coming from an objectivist perspective, you might do more counting. If you're using social construction, you might not. Or your chair might tell you, I want to see the number of participants in this theme and the number of times that this code was applied. The next question is, in the findings section, how do we rationalize whether to prevent single narratives versus themes that would be cross-case analysis? So if you are doing a case study, which I'm assuming, then I would probably urge you to present both. So you want to have a write-up of each case, okay, that really, interrogates that case. But you're also going to need to pull together your cross-case analysis. Okay, so if you have 3 participants, yeah, and in that case, I think it's very so the in this example from this attendee, we have 3 participants. So I would present the narrative for each of those 3. Okay, and that's going to be, where you look at really more of the differences between those 3. And then in another section, you do the cross-case analysis where you look at where those similarities are. We do have time for any more questions. So if you do have questions, go ahead and type those in the questions box. The question is about pricing, and that's one where we would need to talk a little bit more about what specifically you need help with. This is one where I would really encourage you to go ahead and schedule a consultation to talk about that more. All right, I don't see any more questions coming through. So thank you so much for joining me today. Again, everyone will get a copy of this presentation tomorrow, as well as a copy of the slides so that you'll have access to that. That has our information, how to schedule a complimentary 30-minute consultation with us. You can also go to info@statisticssolutions.com or call this number on the screen. Thanks so much for attending. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.